Evening all, welcome back to Deadlight Part 3. So, the protagonist is still rushing his way through Vancouver. Basically, yeah, somehow there seems to be power still in certain areas, but, you know, I'm not going to... Oh my god, that was stupid. Anyway, so playing this wonderful game. Again, I think people are obviously quite liking the stylization of it. Some fantastic comments, some really good suggestions as well of other games out there that may be worthy of consideration. So I'll certainly check them out. I think there's some really quite niche games coming through. And I guess, you know, it's also kind of a continuation of our gaming discussion. It's always interesting hearing what other people play and maybe also how they became interested in gaming as well. I think it is a hobby that I think is sneered on a little bit. It's a shame, to be honest. There are some quite aggressive people, let's say, around gaming. You know, it's a funny one because it is very modern. It's a new thing, basically, that people will, you know, game for fun, for their hobby, for their spare time. And I kind of remember times when I was playing Eve, and we had, you know, a few people in the corporation who basically were completely invested that this was a hobby. So much, and it was funny because they put so much real world money into Eve to fund their hobby because they wanted to get the enjoyment from it. And I'll give you an example of I'll cite a case. Basically, somebody wanted a Titan. Now, a Titan in a Eve is probably the ultimate goal because it's a huge, you know, multi-$1,000 investment. So in game credit, it's probably 100 billion ISK, which you could probably equate to maybe $5,000-$6,000. And it's usually seen as an end game thing. Now, we had a person come in who would probably been in the game only a few months, and already within having been only a few months, they wanted a Titan. So what they did is they bought about $4,500 worth of real game credit. Legitimately, it wasn't RMT, real money trading. It was actually like game cards and selling them. And they did this to basically get the IS together to give to me to build them a Titan. And back then, obviously, I wasn't a scamming piece of shit, so I actually built him it. And it was funny because, again, it was... And that was actually one incident of many. There were actually quite a few who did that, now I think about it. And yeah, the desire for a Titan was just so, you know, kind of strong that they were quite willing to spend thousands of real dollars getting one. And again, I think that's, and I kind of, you know, I myself sat back in amazement and thought, really, why do you want to do this? And the actual reason they gave was such a good reason, and I'll give you it now. What they said is, if I was into golf or if I was into cars, I would spend thousands of dollars on that as my hobby, whereas I'm not. I'm actually into games, and I want to, you know, I spend my free time playing games. So, you know, where's it any different to buying a very expensive set of golf clubs? And yeah, I kind of get it. I mean, I think I do agree with it. I mean, pay to win is always a bit of a dangerous thing in general, but it's fascinating when you kind of distill that logic. So yeah, I just thought I'd share that story with you. And the interesting thing is they played the game for maybe another 6 months and then left. And they actually sold, I think, their account and Titan to another player, which I know is a bit naughty. They shouldn't have done that, but that's very typical of what seems to go on at the moment. Is, you know, if you've got a character with a lot of ISK and a lot of skill points, but also a lot of assets, things like Titans, super carriers, stuff and that, then people will want to pay real world money just to buy that character to then, you know, jump into the game at a very high level. Amazing stuff, really. Again, it's utterly against the game rules, but what surprised me is how people seem to do it and get away with it quite a lot. But interesting stuff, and I think that kind of translates, I think, to gaming just generally. Is, you know, I think where I became interested in gaming was, I think really I read a lot of books as a kid, or rather actually probably I didn't, and I think I was always interested in story. I always used to love films and things like that, and then I always think films were fun. I always used to watch a film and think this is cool, but I was always disappointed that I couldn't control the film. I know, I guess I'm just a control freak, but it was interesting because that desire to really kind of shape the story myself was really what got me into gaming. And I cite an old game, Dune 2, which is based upon Frank Herbert's Dune books. Now, I watched the film of that, and I just became obsessed with the film Dune. I thought it was a fantastic film. And I loved it, but I actually ended up, I'd watch the film, then I'd go and play the game Dune 2, and I'd try and reenact the film in the game. And that's probably my earliest memory. I mean, I know it's probably before that, probably playing Elite, the original Elite. Used to kind of, you know, imagine, you know, you were Star Trek or whatever, but It's all good stuff. I think this is where I kind of got my my kind of desire to game from, was this ability to kind of have a story that I can shape. But anyway, so I think, it's funny. In the story, we've just met up with one of the survivors from the original group. That was the cop, Dwayne, was it? I forget. But basically, that was the cop. He's dead. And that's obviously not looking good for the whole group, because they've just been captured by the New World Order. Is it the New World whatever? So this is pretty shaky. Now, also, the zomboids are pretty much coming at me with vigor, so I need to get the hell out here. So let's just try and escape. Already loving... Oh god, here they come. How do I get down? Alright, there we go. So zombies don't seem to be able to use ladders, which is obviously good. Yep, nope, they can't figure that out, so that's good. I think also in terms of the way that a lot of gaming generally today is shaped as well. I know we've spoken a huge amount about story. Let's talk about maybe the mechanics now as well. I think it's funny how, again, this is just general good business, is most people are looking for the differentiator, not necessarily the, it depends. If you're buying steel, you're buying steel. It doesn't matter. You almost don't want it to be different. You just want it to be cheap. So you basically compete through just whatever's the cheapest price, done. But with games and anything with an artistic component, you're looking for something that's a bit different. And I think some of the big genres, the big games that have done well probably this year, last year, and I think just generally any year, are ones that generally differentiate themselves. They stand apart from the group. So things like Crysis and Crysis 2, Crysis 3, all shooters of that ilk, Far Cry, whatever, they're good, but they never stand out, and I think they try pretty hard to act differently. Oh, look, you get a bow now, or oh, look, you're on an island, you hunt animals. But they're not really very different. Whereas DayZ, which is just, again, another shooter based on Arma 2, old technology, but DayZ was completely different, and again, it's been probably ultimately more successful because it's different. It's actually a shooter which has complete survival capability within it. So you're trying to survive effectively. So I think it's that differentiation that pretty much defines games. Minecraft, another great example, looks terrible, but the fact that it's different, the mechanics act differently. So you have a much higher kind of goal really, because you could do more with it. And I think that's probably a big kind of selling point for a lot of games lately, is if you make it a bit more different, you're going to do quite well. And it's funny because I think obviously people know this, because when you look at most modern games nowadays, they're not necessarily trying to do anything different, but what they'll do is they'll include one mechanic that is totally different, and it'll be something, I don't know, it could be, it can be anything actually. It could be anything that takes the vanilla, genre of the game and makes it a bit more different. Things like Just Cause 2 are probably good examples there, where effectively it's a very vanilla shooter. I mean, it's just another GTA clone, TBH. But the thing that made it different was this kind of grappling hook. And to be honest, you always look for the unique sales point, USP. And with particularly Just Cause 2, the USP was that kind of thing. You do get the odd game which is just incredibly different. Things like, Oblivion, Skyrim, that kind of thing. Very, very different. Again, similar in their kind of category. I mean, effectively, there is really only a few games like Oblivion and Skyrim, but they're all generally by the same creator. A good example here is BioShock as well. BioShock, again, was totally different, or rather it wasn't. Let's just go back one. Let's go to System Shock 2, where it really began, which System Shock 2 was a great example of, a game in its time, very similar to all the others, but what it did bring was a different depth to it. So it was more complex, there was more things you could do with it, etc. And I think that's why it's probably quite successful. And again, BioShock 2 was just building on where System Shock, or rather BioShock and BioShock 2 built upon where System Shock 2 left off. So it's kind of interesting how, sometimes the idea, that unique mechanic or that unique idea, does actually keep a game series or a developer afloat with that particular style. And that's quite sort of interesting to me, because I think You know, a lot of games nowadays, they do generally come up with a good idea, then they'll distill that idea across a number of games. And Skyrim and Oblivion are good examples of that, because they're not really anything new, but they kind of are. Do you know what I mean? Strange double meaning there. So there we go. We've just been run down an alley, and he's having a weird flashback to some kind of parade in the before times. And this is I guess flashback montage. The game is fantastic. I'm really got to admit, I am enjoying this. I think it's one of these games that, again, a bit like Max Payne. Now, there's a game that had a fucking good story, excuse my language. That was an absolutely amazing story, because, again, it's one of those stories that you had to kind of think about. It wasn't a very clear-cut story, so the whole kind of, Valhalla and, the whole... I can't remember the corporate name, but that pretty much was a very multi-leveled story that I thought was deployed very well. The film was a bit shit, not one of the best, but it was alright, watchable. But again, I think that's interesting because, again, how many times have they had in the 80s and 90s? A film would come out like Batman, and then you'd have the Batman game come out with it, and it would generally be absolutely awful. What's interesting is now games are doing it the other way, so you're getting films created around the concept of the game. But what's interesting is there's obviously a real tension between the gaming industry, or the gaming kind of IP ownership, whoever that may be, and the Hollywood studio. Because if you look at the film Doom, that was such a missed opportunity. Now, again, it was all right. It was certainly watchable, but they could have done so much more with that, and I think it was a shame that they didn't. Particularly when you think about the content, the way that they kind of introduced the film as well was, it was all a little bit trying to excuse the science. Oh, well, this is possible, and oh, this is why they're like that. What I think it would have been better is that if they'd just done a little bit sort of tongue-in-cheek and said, do you know what, it's science, it's sci-fi, who knows? And they should have made it a bit more like the game. And, I think it was a little bit too, it was a too modern set as well. It should have been far off in the future, a bit more interesting. And I think certainly a lot of film franchises are looking, I think pretty much ideas are running out there. I think this is why they're probably looking at the game industry now with glee, that it is such a ideas-rich group. I think things like BioShock, I think things like Assassin's Creed, these would all be probably good films, but the only problem is that how do you convey take Assassin's Creed or Max Payne, probably another good example. How can you convey what the game effectively is trying to portray, which is a cop broken, lost his family, bullet time, all that. And they don't really include it. Like, I think Doom was a good example where I think they had a 5-minute, not even 5 minutes, 3 minutes probably, piece where there was a bit of first-person shooting when you walk through a corridor, but it was done so... it wasn't great. And it was probably the only good bit of the film. And I think Max Payne is all about bullet time, and yet he uses bullet time twice. And he doesn't use it, it's just a cinematic effect. Do you know what I mean? Maybe that's just me. I always thought the idea that of Max Payne's capability was that he had some weird heightened sense that allowed him to pretty much see bullet time. He had incredible reactions, whatever it was. Whereas in the film, it was all a little bit kind of higgledy-piggledy, as we would say. It didn't feel like they really kind of paid much credence to what was actually quite an interesting... what was effectively the sizzle of Max Payne. I think everything else they kind of just skirted around the fact that he had lost his family, the fact that blah, blah, blah. Another good one is Hitman. Now, Hitman I think is actually pretty good. The film and the game series, I quite like both of them. I don't like the latest iterations of Hitman. I think they've become a little bit too... They've become almost too clever now. I like the original Hitman where basically you could just do... you could do whatever you wanted, basically. It was a real... exciting, you've got somebody to kill, here's a hotel, get it, go for it. And there are many different ways you could kill them, and I love that. Whereas nowadays, I think it's a bit linear, and it's all a bit kind of, very easy to spot, all that kind of thing, the disguises. Anyway, I think the film they did of Hitman did it as better service as any game film mix can probably do, because they got the character right. I think the character was pretty good. I think the backstory was very well done. And I think, again, it was very kind of based around, right, you've got to kill the Russian, blah, 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 whatever. It was good, and I thought they did quite a good job of it, actually. And that's probably a rare example where I think it's not terrible. But I think, a lot of them lately have just not been good. It's funny because when you look at certain things like, if you look at the other way, now look at things like Game of Thrones and what they're trying to do, it's fascinating seeing the whole Game of Thrones games come out now. Now, again, almost impossible to do, to be honest. The Game of Thrones stuff is just so big and epic in that it's just very difficult to make it work in a game. But weirdly enough, actually a game is probably, it depends which genre you take. The game that came out was very much an RTS, or is it an RPG? RPG, I apologise. And RPGs are good, but very, very difficult to do well. Look at Skyrim. Now, it's interesting that Skyrim originally was meant to be, or possibly going to be, a Game of Thrones game. That's fascinating. If you didn't see that, as on Reddit, that's interesting to me because, again, I think if one gaming company probably could have done it, it would have been Bethesda. But I think it's probably good they didn't, because again, what they've created is better than a franchise that exists already. I think it's good that they've created something new. But again, it depends which game you pick, because again, I would probably say that Game of Thrones and stuff like it doesn't really fit very well in certain game types. So things like Mount and Blade, I've played. Check out my video of it. Mount and Blade did a mod of Game of Thrones, and actually that's probably the only reason, the only area that a Game of Thrones mod works, because it's a complete sandbox, kind of medieval it up kind of game, and it works. It's actually pretty good, and I think I'm actually really cool. I still play it at the moment, so that's pretty cool. But I think generally, a lot of the time, you can't generally change the story or the concept from one format to the other. So BioShock, the film, probably will be terrible. And Halo, the film, will be, literally like pulling teeth. Because, they're great games and they're great stories, but to squeeze it into an hour and a half, 2 hours, because again, this is the problem. You can't. No cinema can really do a 2.5, 3 hour movie without having a bloody good reason as to why not, as into why they should. Because the Hollywood money men will only say the average attention span of the audience is 90 minutes. Anything above that, you're wasting your time. And that's sad, isn't it? That's really appealing to the lowest common denominator. And I think, things like Lord of the Rings and stuff like that tried to and successfully, they did actually extend the kind of what you can do with a movie. But some films of the 80s went on for 4 hours, or rather 70s. And then in the 80s, it's when it pretty much started. So all your Lethal Weapons, your Die Hards and that, they were pretty much told, you've got to do this within 90 minutes. If you push it to 2 hours, you're going to have a bloody good reason why. And story's got to be compelling enough. And to be honest, most films aren't. Batman, I think, is 2 hours. And that was probably one of the only films, the original Batman, that is. The original Batman was, and it was probably one of the only ones that got away with doing that. And that's, again, disappointing to a degree, because I think, again, you could never get the story of Skyrim, you could never get the story of BioShock, particularly Assassin's Creed. And this is why I kind of cringe with fear every time they talk about a movie of Assassin's Creed, because it would just butcher the franchise. I think it won't add value to it. It's already good, it's already great, there's a fantastic story, it's an immersive story. Don't try and legitimize it with a film. It's called willing suspension of disbelief. Okay, and that's actually what the term for how much you're willing to kind of suspend your belief of a particular disbelief, rather. So when you watch a play, if you become immersed with that play, it's called willing suspension of disbelief. And that's because you're kind of there saying, okay, I know it's not real, but I'm really into it. And you willingly suspend that you know it's not real. And I think games do that more than a film does. Now, post in the comments if you disagree. I really do believe it. I think if you play a game, you're more immersed with the product than you are if you're watching a film, because you're watching a story. But in a game, you're watching something very different. You're actually part of it. And I think that's where I think it becomes quite interesting, because in essence, I think the reality of a game versus a film versus a book is that, you're being basically, you're actually shaping the output, which in cases like this game is very linear, but again, I can still control what happens. Anyway, there we go. Some metaphysical, discussions and discourse around how content is delivered to you. Hope you enjoyed that. More in part 4.